Welcome to Reaching Minds, Thoughts for Your Life's Journey. In this episode, we will be diving into an area that touches all of us, our brain. Every decision we make, every habit we form, and every relationship we build begins in the brain. Yet most of us were never taught how it truly works. Today, I'm joined by my guest, Christopher Samsa, a positive psychologist specialising in applied neuroscience and professor of executive education at Hult International Business School. Together, we will unpack what's really happening below the surface in our brain and how we understand our brain can help us to lead to more clarity, empathy, and intention. We will be exploring how neuroscience shapes the way we think, lead, respond to stresses, and navigate change throughout our lives. Now, this is for everyone, for leaders, for professionals, or simply somebody who's curious about their personal growth. And this conversation in Reaching Minds is about making sense of our life journey. Welcome, Chris.
Thanks, Nita. Good to see you again.
Oh, good to see you as well. So, always fascinated about neuroscience and how it sort of unravels in our lives. So, one of the questions I'd like to ask you is what drew you into working with neuroscience and why do you believe it matters for everyday life?
It's interesting because I wasn't drawn to it. It seemed to be drawn to me, I suppose. So I had three careers. I was an actor and a singer for many years. Then I had a career in advertising, ended up on the board of directors of an advertising agency here in London, where I'm based. And then I took a year out. In that year out, I remember very, very clearly, I was sitting at home here in Marylebone and thinking, what am I going to do now after another career seems to, I guess the way I was thinking at the time, another failed career, even though I'd done very well, in both careers. And I picked up the Evening Standard. You may even remember that. And there was a tiny little advert in the Evening Standard and it said, train to be a coach. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I read a bit further and it was this weekend, the next weekend, and it was in a hotel that I can see from my window where I am now. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's fate. So I went along, trained to be a coach, set up my coaching practice, and then started a coach training organization. So out of Australia, met a couple of people who were running a coach training company. And I'm going to ask you a question in a second. And we set up a coach training practice in the UK, which then expanded out into coach training within organizations. And at a certain point of growth within that organizations, we found out that the models that we'd developed were really in alignment with how the brain takes on information, processes and stores information, and then recalls information. And at this point, we were moving into the executive education arena, and we reached out into the world and said, well, why does this stuff work? Why does it seem to be resonating so strongly? We knew it worked with individuals who wanted to train to be with coaches, but why is it resonating so strongly with organizations? And that's when we founded the Neuro Leadership Institute. I'm a founding director and started to work with neuroscientists from all over the world and collaborating with them and saying, well, what are you doing? And taking a piece of research and then saying, how can we make this understandable, usable from a commercial perspective and replicate it then within organizations? So it was a slightly convoluted route that found me where I am today, really loving this career that I've been able to develop that takes on applied neuroscience as a very strong part of that. Then did an MBA, a master's in positive psychology. So I think I'm the world's only positive psychologist specialising in neuroscience at the moment.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, actually. So one of the things I'm aware of around neuroscience is people often perceive it as quite complex. And how does it relate to our daily choices or the behaviors? Can you demystify, the word neuroscience in terms of everyday context?
Yeah, The good news is we are already experts. The only thing that we need is a little bit of information and some language around it to be able to really understand. Because the brain, on the one hand, is highly complex, depending on whichever research you're reading, it has about 135 billion neurons. John Ratey, in his book, A User's Guide to the Brain, sat down and did the maths. And he worked out that there are more ways of creating connections in your brain than there are atoms in the universe. Just think about that for a second. It's phenomenal. So we always think about it as being highly complex and very intricate. But interestingly, it's made up of three elements, the same as most muscles: fat, water, and carbon. So on the other hand, it's quite simple. And from the age we're born, we have it. So we already know how it works. What I love doing is I do some work with an amazing school in Enfield called One Degree Academy, and I go in and I teach Neuroscience 101. I teach the brain from to the really small kids from 5 upwards, and kids just get it. And having a little bit of understanding about how the brain works is really, I think we should be teaching it in all schools, because it helps us, as you were saying in your introduction, it helps us to understand our emotions, number one. One of the reasons I find that neuroscience works so well in organizations is, and you know this, typically people don't want to talk about their emotions or their feelings at work. They might see it as a weakness. They may not have the language or the capacity around it. But actually, they don't mind talking about their brain. So instead of, in an organization, instead of asking the question, how do you feel? I might ask, how does this make you think? When you're in this situation, when you're dealing with this, when you're having a performance review, tell me about your thinking beforehand, during, after. And people can talk very happily about their thinking. Okay, so I'm thinking X, Y, and Z. And that's all we're doing, is demystifying it by putting in very practical and understandable processes. And just understanding that basically your brain can be in one of two places, either in the reward state. And this is from the research of a South African neuroscientist called Evian Gordon. Either in a toward state, this is when we are receiving, say, dopamine, one of a number of positive neurotransmitters. It's the learning process. When you learned how to tie your shoelaces, somebody showed you how to go, you got it wrong, they showed you again. When you got it right, what did they do? They said, wow, Nita, what a clever little girl you are. And that positive feedback that you get is when we would get a burst of dopamine, which is your brain's messenger that says, messaging system that says, hey, remember this thing called shoelace tying? It could be useful. And what that does is, between all of our 135 billion neurons is a little gap called a synapse. And the positive neurotransmitter allows the electricity to pass from one neuron to another, creating a connection and then creating a map in our brain around shoelace tying, around how to feel confident, around how to feel like a failure, whatever it happens to be. That all of that information is. But knowing you can be either in that towards state, or, and we're unfortunately in the other state more often, the threat state or the away state. And this is where the brain says, pay attention to X, there's a danger. When you're being chased down the street by somebody with a weapon, you're in physical danger. But what we're talking about here mainly, for human beings, we're living at the safest, you wouldn't believe it from the news, but we're living at the safest time ever to be alive. We tend not to die from infectious diseases. It's there's less, believe it or not, less violence in the world than there has been historically. But we experience a huge amount of social threat, being left out, feeling rejected, deciding not to speak up in a meeting because the last time you did, somebody criticized you or shouted you down. So actually, just knowing that I'm in one state or the other gives you the ability to say, what happened in that communication, in that conversation I had? And if you know that you were in the threat state, 4 key brain functions tend to shut down: cognition, perception, creativity, and collaboration. Cognition and perception is the amount of information you take in and the amount you can process. Imagine, though, going to work and trying to function without those key 4 brain functions. Life is tough when you're in that place because your brain is very busy managing this potential threat. damn complicated.
No. It's actually clearer for me, because what that makes me think about is the reward and the threat stage. That how often, when you're having conversations with people, whether it's executive coaching or whether it's just most people are away from rather than towards.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm always curious, is that because their four cognitions aren't firing all at the same time, or is it a kind of learned behavior that they've had, that they've stored in their body?
So one of my areas of research is around growth mindset. I'm very lucky. I've worked with Carol Dweck at Stanford researching growth mindset, and I often use the two mindsets, fixed and growth, because it maps beautifully onto the toward and away response. The toward response is the growth mindset. The away response is the fixed mindset, and these are, to a certain extent, learned states to be in. If you have a particular habit that means you get a certain reward, if that is positive, it tends to create more of the growth mindset. If you don't get back what you require at the end of it, and this goes all the way back to our childhood and our education, and I'm not going to use a blanket terminology here, but for some children in some educational establishments, they leave with a fixed mindset about certain abilities because the feedback that they have had is that they're not good. So for me, it was sports. I left school, having been hopeless at all sports, because at my school we played rugby and hockey and football, and I hated all of them. I just didn't like that sort of contact sport. So I left school with this belief that I'm just not good at sport. And that continued through most of my adult life until I decided I was going to run the London Marathon. And it was at the time, it was about this time that I started to understand this concept of growth mindset. So I decided I was going to use myself as an experiment. And the key is you have to change your mindset, because your mindset impacts your beliefs, and your beliefs impact your behaviors, and your behaviors reinforce your mindset. It's a beautiful little triangle. So my fixed mindset was making me believe I wasn't good at sport. The behavior was I would try something new and I would just give up. So I had to start with a growth mindset. Could I run 5K? Well, maybe, let's see what happens. So I developed a belief, and that impacted my behavior. And I'm now not only a regular runner, I've run a number of marathons. I run 10K a couple of times a week. So this fixed mindset belief, the threat state that had come from years of feeling intimidated during physical education classes at school, I was able to change that. But you're right, when you're in that away state, it's very difficult to see, is there another option for me? And we have to prime ourselves for this growth mindset, prime ourselves to be in the toward state. And there are multiple ways of doing that.
Actually, that's where I'm curious, because just thinking about that, it's how do you move from a place? So let's say as a leader, you're under a lot of pressure, and what might be triggering for you in that context is I'm not good enough. So how do you move from having a under pressure, feeling not resourceful, to a more growth mindset? How do you shift yourself? So, somebody listening into this program, Chris, how can they begin to maybe use that for themselves, without going off to go and see an expensive coach or something? So tell me.
I was just about to recommend that. Get it done. It's a great question. So the first thing is realization. You have to recognize that I'm in a particular place. And very often, if you're a senior leader in an organization, you don't have time. You end up taking that stuff home with you, so it impacts on your personal life as well. So I always say that 9/10 of any change is the realization that you have to change. Once you've recognized what it is needs to happen, or what habit or behavior is no longer serving you, the actual change piece isn't so difficult. And very often leaders are not able to recognize that, because if you've got to a senior position in an organization through being directive and not being empathetic, well, actually, I've been successful using these strategies. Why would I change? I'm earning a lot of money. I have all of the trappings that go with that. But ultimately, I've been talking to leaders quite a bit recently about legacy. So as I'm getting older, I seem to be working with people who are also getting older. And a lot of people are saying, one of my colleagues at the business school taught me this wonderful three questions to ask yourself when you're thinking about legacy. How do I leave the room? How do I leave the organization? How do I leave the planet? And these are the three legacy questions I've been asking. I love them. They're so powerful. So when you leave the room as a leader, how do you want to leave it? With people saying, "Oh, bloody hell, I'm glad that he's going on holiday. At least we'll have a break from him." Probably most of us don't want that. How do you leave the organization? What do you want your legacy to be? Because we feel that we had this huge impact when we're in organizations, and then, when we're gone, what's happening? But that leads you ultimately to the question, what do I want to leave behind as my legacy?
Before we continue, I'd love to invite you to visit my website, where you'll find more resources to support your personal and professional journey. Whether you're exploring leadership development, coaching, supervision, or inclusive workplaces, you can go and visit there for deeper reflections to help you to grow. You'll find everything at nitasharma.com. It's also the best place to connect with me directly and discover what's coming up. And of course, there are all the back catalogue episodes of podcasts that you can tap into and gain lots of wisdoms and reflections. I don't think leaders necessarily, I'm generalizing, think about their legacy, because I think from my experience working with leaders, they're pretty kind of stuck and trapped in where they are, because as you described, Chris, they're thinking, well, I made it this far. I don't need to do anything more. Well, actually, one's self-development, one's growth doesn't stop because you become the CEO. There's more work to be done. And I don't think individuals necessarily, and, please correct me, think about, what's the impact am I having? When I leave the room, people are, as you're saying, they're going, oh, wow, great. He's left or she's left, or, or are they doing something sort of differently? Because maybe they don't have the time or space, because everything is so volatile, fast and quick, that they don't have time to think about their legacy or what impact am I having. I don't know. You do work around the world with amazing leaders. What's your perspective on that?
Justin Trudeau, at the last World Economic Forum that he attended, said the world has never been so fast, and yet it will never be this slow again. And I was talking to some leaders in a program in Japan recently, and the client said, "Oh, we want to talk about the VUCA world," and most people have heard of that, volatile,
Yeah.
etc. And I said, "Oh, we've moved beyond VUCA now. It's BANY. I can't even remember. Brittle, anxious, da da da." And when I was doing my research, there's a new one, tuna, TUNA, and I said, the world is now so complex that one acronym no longer serves us. We need three to summarize it. I'm sort of still reflecting on your question around what do individuals do to change. So one is realization, but then there's some great work by an American researcher called Charles Duhigg. I hope I'm pronouncing his surname correctly, on habits. Because if you think about it, as human beings, we are just a collection of habits, thinking habits, physical habits, emotional habits, something that is repeated, a collection of neurons wired together. And he talks about really needing to recognize even habits that don't serve us, people constantly getting into relationships with people who are not good for them, who tend to repeat behavioral patterns that are familiar. But there has to be a reward in there for the brain to hardwire it to want to keep doing it, even if the outcome is not no longer positive. At some stage, it was. He uses a very simple example of, every afternoon I would at a certain time go up to the canteen, buy a cookie, a biscuit, eat it, have a chat, and then go back to my desk. And he realized that the reward wasn't the cookie. Eventually, the reward was social interaction. And recognizing that what the reward is gives you the opportunity then to say, I'm going to make a change here. So then what he did at this time of day, each day, he would get up, he'd go and find somebody to talk to, have a bit of a gossip, and then go back to work. And it still fulfilled this need. So he was able to change this habit because he was able to recognize what the reward is. And that can be really, really difficult. That's where you have to put in the work. You said about, needing to constantly be in this world of development. And I always say that leadership is the longest apprenticeship in the world. It's an apprenticeship that you never get to the end of. And, leaders that I'm working with who are in this legacy phase, many of them are the ones that seem to resonate most strongly for me are the ones that are still learning, right up until their last day within the organization. They're still looking to learn from other people. And I think for me, that's what separates out good leaders from great leaders.
So I wonder what percentage of leaders who actually do that, because in some of the work that I've done um, with individuals, I'm not sure they've kind of had their growth kind of mindset into. I mean, I'm not talking executive coaching, but just observing them on a leadership program. That's their way of the long handle screwdriver or micromanagement, and works for them because the reward is they get to control. How do you get somebody who says, well, that's the reward I get, I get to manage people? How do you get them to shift from that? Because in a way, that's an away from rather than towards, I'm thinking.
My first ever coach mentor told me one day, if somebody doesn't want to be coached, you can't coach them.
No.
And it's the same with any change, behavior or whatever, any change process. You have to want to make a change. You have to want to make a difference. So maybe a leader has had some feedback, which, every time somebody tries to give you feedback, you get very defensive. And that message comes up. And if you've got a certain amount of awareness, you're going to eventually say, hey, I'm hearing this message a little bit. What do I need to do here? So there has to be a certain amount of self-awareness that is going to lead you in that direction to want to change. In organizations, of course, we have built-in processes and systems that mean we're going to come up against that sort of feedback. So in some ways, that's an advantage. We're working in a corporate environment that you're going to be exposed to feedback, whether you ask for it or not, whether or not you take any notice of it. I can't emphasize strongly enough, though, working with a coach is, a phenomenal way. So I was working with a CEO of a very successful organization who was starting another company as well, and came into the first session, and I said, what is it you want from these sessions? And they said, I want you to help me go faster. I'm already going at 95% in terms of how fast I can go. You've got to get me up to 110%. And, at the end of that session, I said, is it okay if I share something with you? And he said, yeah. And I said, I think that my role is to help you slow down. And he just went, oh my goodness, you're right. And just having that external voice, that external observer to be able to say, listen, mate, but you're not going to be able to continue like this. How about we try something different? Because of course, as well, we call it the shadow side of leadership. The higher up you go in an organization, the less challenge you get, the less you've got people questioning you because you're in a senior position.
So I just want to pick up what you were sort of saying, the leader that you were working with, and they sort of went, okay, I need to slow down. What happens, you're working with somebody and they go, oh, listen, I've tried it. It doesn't work. It fails. I can't form a new habit. What do you say in regards to that?
So in a coaching situation,
Yeah.
and I still do coach these days, that doesn't make up much of my work. I would ask them to tell me about a time where they have changed a habit and it's been successful. Tell me about a time when you recognize you needed to change and you've changed successfully. What happened there? Okay. So I'm hearing you can change. What was different? What's different about this situation to that situation? Coaching is just really reflecting back. I use neuroscience in my coaching sessions. It
Yeah.
sounds like you're feeling threatened here. And again, if I'm working, it sounds, a little bit of a cliche, but especially with senior men, male leaders that don't have the vocabulary to talk about how emotionally they may be held back. Actually giving them the language around the brain. Hey, did you know that when your brain's in a threat state, which is, I think, what you're describing here, it becomes harder for us to collaborate. It becomes harder for us to think innovatively. And you're giving them a language that is more accessible to use in those situations.
How does sort of neuroscience and positive psychology blend together, or is it the same? I don't know.
What is it that we all want as human beings? So I tend to use the word happiness. So very often I'll ask that question as a leader. What's the most important question you can ask somebody on your team? My personal belief is that what we're actually all searching for is contentment, but happiness is the word I would tend to use, and that would be the word. Are you happy? It's a really difficult question for us to ask people in our team because there's only really two answers, yes or no. And we're all taught not to ask closed questions. If we don't want somebody to say no because I've already got enough to do without dealing with you being unhappy at the workplace. But as a leader, I want to know that information. If somebody's not happy, I'm only getting a smallish percent of them showing up for work. If the reply is yes, that's beautiful, great. What is it you like? How can we help you do more of that? That's really straightforward. No, okay. Um, let's spend some time thinking about that and see if we can. It might be that actually helping that person to leave your team or even leave the business is a better use of resources than having somebody drawing a salary and only getting, I don't know, 50% output from them or productivity or something. Did that answer the question?
Oh, I think so, actually, because I'm thinking about sort of the word happy, because happy for me, and you use the word
Yeah,
contentment. Now, is contentment the same as joy?
that's a great question. I I love Mo Gawdat. I don't know if you've come across him. He's has this amazing sort of equation for happiness. He's written a book, The Happiness, or is it called The Happiness Principle? Anyway, he worked at Google. He
Yes.
within 4 hours went from being on holiday with his son to his son dying.
Yes.
So very, very tragic circumstances. And him and his son were working on this equation for happiness together at the time. And he realized that no amount of grieving or crying or locking yourself away would ever bring his son back. But maybe through sharing this formula in his work, he could make he eventually got to 1 million people happier as a result of this work. Therefore, the world would be a slightly happier place than when his son Ali had left the world. And he's now touched the lives of millions and millions of people. And I like he describes this sort of happiness. The word happiness for us as human beings is, you have a really miserable week, and at the weekend you go out, you get drunk, you go and party, whatever it happens to be, and we think that this is what happiness is. Happiness turns up at the weekend when we switch off from the stuff we're not happy about. But happiness is really about being he uses the glass half full and half empty. If it's half full, that's one thing. If it's half empty, the other. But actually, just being content with what is in the glass is
Ah.
important to us. Just being content with what is in the glass.
Wow. Okay. And what that leads me to, I mean, I understand that people might be delusional
Yeah,
in
they
terms of what's in their glass. There are people I know who are happy with, a nice house, a nice car, a nice, I don't know, money at their disposal and so forth. And that's happiness for them. Whereas for me, happiness is more than just that. It's about my internal contentment around not necessarily am I making a difference in the world, although legacy is important for me. It's also around, how do I feel inside my own body? Am I contented with who and what I am, really?
And you've answered the question yourself because you're using the word contentment rather than what's in the glass. For me, it's about being contented, and you can be content with very little. I read something, it came up on my social media the other day, um, being alone at home is happiness for me. And I completely understand that, being able to be on one's own just and to be content with that rather than. So I know that you've had my friend and colleague Robert Hutchinson on one of these podcasts, and I use the Enneagram like him. I'm a type 4, and one of the traits of a type 4 is looking out into the world and seeing what you don't have rather than what you have. So, looking and seeing couples together and saying, oh, why am I on my own? And it's taken me years of work to move away from that natural thought of mine, to be content with being a single human being. And the planet isn't set up for single people like me. But actually, I would say, having turned 60 last year, I'm in an incredibly contented place, very happy with what I have, very, very happy with the work that I do. And in so many ways, I'm so fortunate.
Mm. And just one sort of kind of couple of last questions that I'm curious about. When you're working with leaders, you're running workshops around neuroscience, I'm kind of sort of fascinated how you take them through that journey of where potentially the light bulb goes on for them.
Yeah, for me, workshops have to be experiential and they have to be fun. Two key things. Everyone's sat through hours of workshops where somebody is just preaching at you. So all of the work that I do is designed with the brain in mind, and we learn best when we're doing something, all of us. That's why somebody doesn't teach you how to tie your shoelaces as a kid just by telling you. They show you have a go at it. This is because it creates multiple neural connections in the movement part of the brain, the seeing part, the audible part, etc., etc. So I always design programs that are very experiential and humor. Doesn't matter. I'm often in a room with multiple different languages and cultures, and humor, letting people have fun when they're doing something, for me, is the multiplying factor. So you can take a very complex idea, so for example, it's really simple. I often am talking about change. You get people to fold their arms. That's
Mm,
specific. You don't have to think about it. And you say, oh, fold your arms in the other direction, the non-dominant way. And they're like, oh my goodness, I can't.
mm,
Suddenly you have. This is because our brains are designed to resist change. And when we ask our brain to do something differently, it automatically puts the brakes on. There's a slight threat state. It says, oh, hang on a second. Why are we using resources, glucose and oxygen, to do something that we may not find is useful?
mm. That's a great way of doing the kind of, workshops. I agree with you that having experiential fun and working, giving individuals things to stretch themselves with, and maybe offering different perspective is an essential part of perhaps them considering oh, I can use this in my world without it shifting things about my core identity. I don't know. It seems to me that sometimes people, I'm just going off at a tangent here, that sometimes people don't change because they have an investment in their core identity of who they are.
So just like folding your arms in the other direction,
Yeah.
starting to somebody to change a part of their core identity, a belief or a behavior, that is tough. That's hard work. We all know learning something new can be challenging. You know, think about during the pandemic, people took up all sorts of things, musical instruments, languages. It's a tough ask. But if it's something that you've been doing your whole life and then you have to change it, you know, those neural connections are incredibly well embedded through the process of neuroplasticity. And to make that change is very, very tough. And it's why we have to recognize what's the reward? How can I make this change? Very simple little mechanism we teach from the work of a researcher called Peter Gollwitzer. He calls them implementation intentions. They're now called if-then plans, but they support behavioral change because they allow your brain to do the thinking in advance. So if I find myself in situation X, then I will do the new behavior instead. If I'm receiving feedback on my work, instead of getting defensive, so if I'm receiving feedback on my work, then I will ask questions rather than get defensive. That allows our brain to have a different option next time we're receiving feedback. Oh, okay, yeah, because you've done the thinking in advance. And when we're in the threat state, it's difficult to do new thinking.
You're absolutely right. I mean, I can think about a recent incident whereby my normal strategy, this is in a group setting, is that if I'm not getting what I think I want, my strategy in the past was, have a strop and withdraw from the group. And I decided I wasn't going to do this. I was going to go and speak to the leader and say, well, actually, what we're doing isn't working for me. So can we think about doing something different? Now, I know I've tried this before previously, but sometimes you're not heard. And then you think, well, this isn't the place I can do this work. So I need to rethink my relationship. However, I know that's a core part of me. I withdraw and have a strop and something. But actually, this time it worked. Maybe I didn't get everything that I wanted, but I know that I was heard enough for me to make that less blaming them, but more taking responsibility for myself and say, I've got to do this for myself. And that's an old, old habit. I'm long in the tooth. It's been around forever for me, but I did make a shift. But you're right, that sort of residual is still there. And I know I can feel it.
And when we make that shift, that is beautiful evidence for the brain that this other way, this other route works. So
Yes.
in the past, it hasn't worked for, oh, well, I wasn't heard, I wasn't listened to, nothing changed. See, I told you so, your brain says,
Yeah.
forget it. So you have to persevere and you have to get the evidence. Your brain is always looking for evidence to back up a particular behavior. If we ask our brain to look for something, see, that behavior doesn't work. It's going to look for that evidence. So we have
Yes.
to ask it to look for something else. Actually, I did that. I didn't get everything that I wanted, but something did change. You're much more likely to feel motivated to go for it next time.
Yeah, it's what I call the syndrome of if I see a white BMW car, I see it everywhere. So it becomes like a self-fulfilling prophecy. So as we bring our lovely conversation to a close, Chris, what are some of the tips or wisdom can you depart to our listeners that they can begin to sort of think about this in a very practical day-to-day way for themselves?
Okay. So my one, this may or may not relate to what, but my one key thing, and this comes from my positive psychology, is find out what you're naturally good at and do more of it. So we know that people who work with their strengths, their talents, are happier in the workplace. They make better colleagues, better partners. They tend to overachieve in terms of these particular areas. And so many of us go through life doing a job that we're sort of okay at. We were pretty good at maths, so we did a degree in accountancy. We became an accountant. So yeah, work with what you're good at, and it will serve you very well.
Okay. And one final question, which I ask my guests: what's the motto do you live your life from?
There's a wonderful, I speak French, and there's a wonderful saying from Robespierre, which is "Après toi, la déluge." After you, the others follow. And I think that that's so true. The legacy we leave behind. This is what people are following. So, après toi, la déluge.
Wow. Okay, lovely. Actually, that sounds beautiful. It's the same as modeling behavior and congruency, all wrapped up in one, that people will follow you and then remember you in terms of who you are. As I think there's a very famous quote from Maya Angelou who says, people might say, it's how you leave people feeling at the end of the day that really counts.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you very much, Chris. I really enjoyed our conversation. I love the meandering into different areas, and I'm so glad a year on we were able to do that. So thank you so much.
Thank you again. Thank you.
If you're interested in working with me, connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, or www.nitisharma.com. And if you enjoyed the podcast, why not consider subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you have access to your podcast, and leave a review.